And I'll see you in my next video, which will definitely be the Cruel Seas redesign video. Unless I get sidetracked and do it about plesiosaurs not being able to walk on land or something. I don't know. Well past me? You were wrong. I did not, in fact, get sidetracked on a plesiosaurs not being able to walk on land video. I got sidetracked by Nanotyrannus, and the video did surprisingly well. And now I'm here talking about Liopleurodon's size, because that's a much more complicated subject than plesiosaurs not having limbs that attach to their spines. Yes, here we are, talking about Liopleurodon's size. How big it was, why it got so big in Walking with Dinosaurs, and the winding road it took to get to both. Before we start, as in all my videos, every source I use will be cited in the description and in a little card thingamabob in post. So how big was Walking with Dinosaurs Liopleurodon? I'll just let Kenneth Branagh say it.
Liopleurodon. At 150 tons.
Liopleurodon was so big it knocked over everything. You know, that same tired comment I get over and over again might actually be right. This Liopleurodon was magic and actually made all of my dinosaurs fall over. The hell? Wouldn't be my channel if everything went as planned, now would it? 25 meters and 150 tons. That's insane! That's the size of a blue whale. That's larger than Ichthyotitan estimates. How on earth could the creators of the show have done this? Well, if we flip open the Walking with Dinosaurs evidence book, we can see that they actually give an estimate of 20 meters and only 20 tons? Okay, I seem to have misremembered this. The book actually says that Liopleurodon wouldn't even be half as heavy as the largest whales, and it gives a range of 100 to 200 tons for the largest blue whales, so this would mean that 50 to 100 tons is the ceiling for Liopleurodon based on the evidence book. They cite fragmentary remains of large pliosaurs that hint at animals at around this size, even though most scientists believe that Liopleurodon was between 5 and 10 meters. In particular, they note a dorsal vertebrae discovered in 1996, which will be really important. But that is the main fossil that they use to justify this. And they add that since it's statistically extremely unlikely we'll ever find the biggest of any fossil animal, let's just add on a couple more meters for good measure. And this is a hypothetical maximum estimate Liopleurodon, and the narration actually supports this.
This male measures a colossal 25 meters and is big even for his kind.
If you're wondering how we got from 150 tons in the show to like 50 tons in the book, they write that it's because since Liopleurodon lived in such warm seas, it wouldn't have any blubber and would therefore be way lighter than comparably sized whales. Now, this is very strange to me and inaccurate. First of all, thanks to Frey et al. 2017, we know that plesiosaurs had blubber, at least in Mauriciosaurus. And thanks to Fleischl et al. 2018, we know that plesiosaurs were warm-blooded animals. And I don't know about you, but I can't think of a single warm-blooded animal that doesn't have blubber. Even in warm climates, I mean, have you seen a monk seal before? But even before that, we know that leatherback sea turtles have blubber, so it's not like this is just, oh, it's outdated. This was just a strange thing to say in general. Something important to note is that Walking with Dinosaurs the evidence isn't what the actual creators made to document all the discoveries and reasons for the reconstructions. As Darren Naish, one of the co-authors, wrote in the comments of Mark Whitten's blog post on giant marine reptiles, the book was written after the show had aired, and Naish had no involvement with the show itself. He said that he didn't agree with the ridiculous size, and said that the section in the book was, quote, shall we say, diplomatic in its wording. In a post on his blog Tetrapod Zoology, Naish doesn't blame Tim Haynes or any of the other creators of the show for this, saying that they were just following their consultants, who pushed the idea as scientifically justifiable and reasonable extrapolation. Naish doesn't actually say who these consultants were, which is kind of frustrating, but I can understand not wanting to besmirch a colleague's reputation. However, later, Dave Martell admitted it was him who came up with the idea and that he got it horrendously wrong. Now, let's get into what's been published. Talking about pliosaur size is somewhat complex, as you can probably tell by the runtime of this video. There are many different methodologies done by different authors who have access to different specimens of different sizes and different qualities, and many size estimates are rough initial guesstimates without rigorous methodology. The easiest and most accurate way to reconstruct the size of one of these animals is to have a complete skeleton with minimal taphonomic distortion that's been prepared correctly. Taphonomic distortion is basically whatever damage or warping occurs after spending tens of millions of years sandwiched between literal tons of Earth. Liopleurodon blesses us with 0 complete skeletons, contrary to what the evidence book says. It's not unique in this though. Pliosaurs tend to not preserve complete remains often. The longest complete specimen of pliosaur we have is the holotype of Romaleosaurus cramptoni, which was given a length of 7 meters by Smith and Dyke 2008. There are larger pliosaurs. In fact, Sachikosaurus' holotype is almost complete and was measured at 9.9 meters, but it's not 100% complete, so I guess it doesn't cut it. The point is that
this is an exception and not the status quo.
Before we get into actual pliosaur size estimates, there's some important context I need to set up, and that is the Harvard Kronosaurus. This is MCZ 1285, and it was super influential and basically had a hand in pliosaur reconstructions for decades after it was created. The issue is that it is so reconstructed. Its nickname is Plasterosaurus, and if you look at it, there's several issues. The Kronosaurus' skull, for example, is weirdly high up. It almost has like a cranial crest of some kind. It's very bizarre. More importantly, it was too long. The mount had a historical length of 12.8 meters long, and this acted as the benchmark for pliosaur sizes in the 20th century. However, McHenry 2009 revised this down to around 10.7 meters, and Zhao in 2026 revised that down further to 10.4 meters. This is because it had too many vertebrae, with McHenry believing it had up to 8 extra ones that were reconstructed. And of course this would inflate how long it is. So basically, whenever you see historical pliosaur reconstructions 12 meters and above, it's using the Harvard Kronosaurus as a model basis. We don't have any complete skeletons for Liopleurodon, but we do have a lot of material from it. Even still, scaling it is tricky because we have to take into account the finer details of pliosaur proportions. Pliosaurs aren't as uniform as they might seem. Some basopliosaurids, like Attenborosaurus, have body plans that are beautifully plesiosauroid-esque. When it comes to Liopleurodon, we have to take a look at the clade within the Pliosauridae family, called the Lassophonia. Within the Lassophonia are the largest and most recognizable pliosaurids like Kronosaurus, Pliosaurus, Sachikosaurus, and of course, Liopleurodon. With how often we get large pliosaurs that only preserve limited remains, it's very tempting to scale them to what we consider close relatives. However, the bones we choose matter. Take the propodials, for example. This is the term for a plesiosaur's upper limb bone. Limb bones are often widely used in estimating the size of land animals. How many examples of giant sauropods have you seen where the estimates come from a femur's testimony? The issue here is multifaceted. Firstly, gravity isn't anywhere near as big of a concern for marine animals, so what could be traditionally considered closely tied to size in terrestrial animals is kind of moot in marine ones. It's how plesiosaurs get away with not having any connection between their limbs and their axial skeleton. There's also several studies that point to large pliosaurs having a ton of variation in the size of their flippers, meaning that simple comparison isn't reliable. The holotype of Pliosaurus funki has a nearly complete forelimb that's approximately 3 meters long. Just for reference, this is the length of a blue whale's flipper. It's crazy. While size estimates have fluctuated, if we use Zhao 2026's length estimate of 9.791 meters, we get a front flipper that's 30.64% of the total length. Meanwhile, Sachikosaurus vitae was given an initial length of 9.9 meters by Paramo Fanesca et al. 2018, but was slightly increased to 10.34 meters by Zhao in 2026. That animal's distal forelimb isn't as well preserved as we'd like, so they don't give us straight up length in the description. However, if we finagle with the scale bar a bit, we can see it's probably around 1.5 meters, maybe a bit more, but if we take that, that's only 14.49%. Part of this might be because Sachikosaurus is a Brachycaucanian. Within the Lassophonia, we have the subfamily Brachycaucaniinae. which contains a lot of the giant pliosaurs from the early Cretaceous. Kronosaurus, Sachicosaurus, and Monkerosaurus all fall into this subfamily. These are distinguished from Thalassophonians in a couple of ways, most prominently in their vertebrae. Brachiochenians lack a subcentral foramina on their vertebrae, and there are some proportional differences, like Kronosaurus having cervical centra wider than those of the dorsal vertebrae, which isn't the case in non-Brachiochenians. They also tend to have shorter flippers and shorter necks with fewer cervical vertebrae in them. Sachicosaurus had 12 cervicals, meanwhile Pliosaurus brachyspondylus had 19 cervicals, and Liopleurodon is thought to have 20, at least according to Dan Folks in his blog post explaining his reconstruction of Pliosaurus carpenteri. Folks doesn't actually cite anything for this number, but he is a very well-respected paleoartist, so I'm inclined to take his word for it. Brachiochenians also had larger heads, with them being thought to have a head-to-body ratio of roughly 1:4, while Liopleurodon had a head-to-body ratio of around 1:5, according to Noe et al. But is that even the case?
I don't know.
Liopleurodon's head proportions have gone through some changes over the years. Newman and Tarlow 1967 was where this very recognizable reconstruction of Liopleurodon comes from. Or is it Liopleurodon?
I don't know.
It has a head-to-body ratio of around 1:4. Tarlow gave a ratio of 1:7 sometime in the 20th century. The only source for this I could find was the late Richard Forrest's old plesiosaur website, but he was a respected plesiosaur paleontologist, so I'll take his word on this. A 1:7 head-to-body ratio would definitely scale Liopleurodon up considerably, since skull material, which we have a good amount of, would correspond to longer animals. But after this was rejected, there would be two main camps for Liopleurodon proportions that I would find while researching this video, 1:5 and 1:4. I was originally on the 1:5 side, and that's how I wrote it in my script and how I based a bunch of size estimates later on. However, lo and behold, a paper on Liopleurodon's size showed up on July 16th, and I have to rewrite my script again! This paper by Bartlett et al. Goes with a 1:4 ratio. In fact, Wikipedia changed its article on Liopleurodon a couple of days after the paper dropped to remove mention of the proportions from Noe et al. And opting for the new interpretation of the new paper. Yet in Bartlett et al., they never specifically acknowledged this departure from what was considered standard Liopleurodon proportions. And to make matters more confusing, the Wikipedia page has a reconstruction of Liopleurodon by Zhao still there, and presented as accurate, despite it going with the 1:5 proportion scheme. So what the heck is going on? Let's dissect how the two versions of Liopleurodon's body plan were achieved and compare them. We have to remember that just because a paper is new, that doesn't mean it's automatically more correct than those that came before. Noe et al. 2003 is the first place I found the 1:5 idea. They give a more specific 1 to 5.19. This is based on observations of the specimen GPIT 1754/2. They don't go into the minutiae of the measurements or even show a figure, but that's what they give. Besides Wikipedia, I saw this repeated in places like Mark Whitten's blog post, and again in Zhao 2026. Zhao doesn't go into how this reconstruction was created in the 2026 paper, but in his preprint from 2024, he discusses it in the supplementary material. He mentions that his skeletal is based on specimen GPIT RE 3184. He pulls much from Linder 1913, what appears to be a book in German I do not have access to. So I'll take Zhao's interpretation at face value for now. Besides that paper, he used photogrammic techniques to get the length measurements of the different body parts, which I sort of inherently distrust since I believe that hands-on measurements and descriptions trump all. That said, this is a commonly used practice which McHenry used for a bunch of the pliosaurs in his paper, like the size estimation of Monkerosaurus boyacensis, which was a species of Kronosaurus at the time. I'm probably just needlessly cautious because of how much inconsistency can creep in when it comes to observations from photos. It's how we get Longrich thinking that Stygivinator is real, while Zano and Napoli, who actually looked at the Stygivinator holotype, can't find any distinguishing characters for it. The 1:4 ratio I first saw in Martel et al. 2023. That paper's main focus was describing a partial cervical series nicknamed the Abingdon pliosaur, as well as another vertebrae. Abingdon pliosaur's main claim to fame is its size, but determining what proportions to follow was key in scaling it, and Liopleurodon was among the taxa used as models. This was based on specimen NHMUK R3536, one of the most complete Liopleurodon we have, which was described by Andrews 1913. I saw it again, this time much farther back in Martel 1992, where he gave a brief description of specimen PETCM R296, which he referred to Liopleurodon, and that had a skull length of 1 meter, so he thought it had to have a total length of 4 meters. Until Bartlett et al. 2026, I hadn't seen this in a publication again. I had initially dismissed this because of the way the scaling for the Abingdon pliosaur was achieved. They averaged out the lengths of the 4 cervical vertebrae, multiplied that with the total number of cervicals they thought it had, and scaled it to the corresponding proportions of the various pliosaurs they used as models. I was skeptical of this, thinking that the length of the vertebrae should decrease as they got to the head. I checked the description of Sachicosaurus, which was one of the animals used in that study, and found that this was indeed the case. I felt so smart, having poked a hole in a paper that was proposing giant pliosaurs. I felt like I had cracked some sort of case, but I was wrong. Fortunately for me though, I decided to double check myself before making this video. I went back to Andrews 1913 and looked at the cervical vertebrae dimensions for NHMUK R3536, and
Looky here, boy!
They are quite similar across the board without a pattern of increase or decrease. This is why you double check stuff. Hopefully I didn't forget to double check anything else in this video. Fun fact, the Safari LTD Liopleurodon is actually almost perfect 1/35th scale for the size estimate given in Noe et al. 2003, but they don't use their head proportions. Curious. Bartlett et al. Got their ratio from measurements of specimen GPIT PV 393. This is a specimen housed at the Geologisch Paläontologisch Institut Tubingen. I am not going to try to repeat that again, I'm so sorry to my German viewers. Like Plasterosaurus, this is an iconic mount that's responsible for some chicanery. Remember the splayed out forward-facing teeth in the Walking with Dinosaurs Liopleurodon? That was because of this. Liopleurodon and pliosaurs in general had straight tooth rows. Attentive viewers may have noticed something. I repeated the photo for GPIT 1754/2, GPIT RE3184, and GPIT PV 393. Side note, I'm just going to call these specimens by their last couple of characters to save time and my sanity. I had a whole spiel ranting about how confusing it was for different specimen numbers to mean the same mount that in places I looked wasn't even called by those specimen numbers, it was just called the Tubingen mount, but I'm just gonna sum it up for both of our sakes. Basically, this mount is thought to be a composite made up of the specimens on screen here, with 93 being the name of the mount as a whole. And this might be why different people looking at this reconstruction will have different measurements and proportions. However, Bartlett agrees with Noe 2001 in thinking that this is one animal except for an ilium, so really, who knows at this point? Side note, I can't access Noe 2001, so, you know, can't verify that.
Open that bridge, Varmint! Open it, I say!
O'Keefe 2002 gives us morphometric data on /2, which I'm assuming means the mount as a whole. The neck of the mount is 103.5 centimeters, while the skull is 93 centimeters. This would follow the 1:5 ratio and looks like Zhao's reconstruction, with the head being shorter than the neck. Quick bit on plesiosaur anatomy. As laid out in Adam Smith's post on the subject, the cervical and dorsal vertebrae can be distinguished by the position of their respective ribs. In the cervical vertebrae, the ribs are positioned on the vertebral centra, while in the dorsal vertebrae, they are on the transverse processes. And in the transition between the cervicals and dorsals, called the pectoral vertebrae, you can see this slow migration upwards. This is important in judging the Tubingen mount. It's heavily restored, and while there's a good bit of material in there, it's obscured by stuff. It's also got a really dinky tail, which probably led to Greg Paul's skeletal from 2021. And it has extra plaster vertebrae artificially extending it. Linder 1913 wrote that the specimen had 15 cervicals, 3 pectorals, 21 dorsals, and 13 caudals, and that the mount had 22 cervicals, 3 pectorals, and 23 dorsals. Wow, it really is like Plasterosaurus. Since it's so close to Andrew's description of NHMUK PVR 3536, Zhao believes it's possible that that was its basis. If this is the case, then this would likely indicate the 1:5 head-to-body ratio is faulty, not taking the level of restoration of the specimen into account. The number of cervical vertebrae used by Folks may come from Andrews. Zhao notes in the supplementary material of his preprint that there's an inconsistency in Andrews' 1913. Andrews wrote that Liopleurodon had 18 cervical vertebrae, and a couple pages later says it had 20, excluding the atlas and axis. The atlas and axis are the first and second cervical vertebrae respectively. In plesiosaurs, they are fused into a single complex. While researching this video, I couldn't tell if when people noted a certain number of plesiosaur cervical vertebrae included or excluded the atlas-axis complex, if they were counted as 1 or 2. If my interpretation is correct, they are counted as separate when talking about the total number of cervical vertebrae, but are counted together when doing vertebral measurements. This would mean that Folks went with 18, and Bartlett et al. Actually go with 22, which means that the neck actually isn't too long in the Tubingen mount. Ultimately, I'm more in the 1:4 head-to-body ratio camp for a couple of reasons. This is the most recent morphometric data that we have, and Bartlett et al. Actually goes through a ton of Liopleurodon specimens, 37. This is a lot more than any of the other studies, and should therefore be more reliable. But also, we've seen that the 1:5 ratio is mostly based on the Tubingen mount, while the 1:4 ratio at least has other specimens that don't have as much ambiguity supporting it. Well, that was a very long-winded way to say I trust the newest paper, but I think that me going through the methodologies of the papers and analyzing them is part of the appeal of this channel, rather than regurgitating whatever's newest as correct. Plus, even though Liopleurodon, presumably Pliosaurus, and the Brachiokennians have similar head proportions, the successive taxa leading up to those mentioned do tend to have the 1:5 condition. And it's not just me who thinks that proportions are important. Zhao noted in his 2026 paper that McHenry's dissertation actually had a limitation in his size estimates due to the fact that he used 2 pre-existing models as body plans to sort of bracket pliosaur size. He used Newman and Tarlow's pliosaur and the Invicta pliosaur, but this doesn't really account for different body proportions, and Adam Smith actually notes that the Invicta looks very similar to Newman and Tarlow's reconstruction and might be based on it. But regardless, we're going to be using Bartlett et al.'s reconstruction. Let's work our way up from the smallest to the largest Liopleurodon specimens. This isn't going to be all of them, but I think it's a pretty good spread. And here's me for scale. Look at him, waving like a dork. Time for me to shut up and just let you guys see these size comparisons for yourself. Well, let's compare the largest Liopleurodon specimen with the Walking With Dinosaurs Liopleurodon, and yeah, that's ridiculous. Version, it's still ridiculous. But, hey, at least now we know how big it really was. The reason that I didn't touch on masses in this video as much as I probably should have is because all of the masses that you see in Liopleurodon literature are now basically outdated because they all went with the larger body proportions. And they were already quite rare to begin with. but I'll just lay them out here. McHenry got a range of 0.998 to 1.736 tons for his Liopleurodon specimen that he looked at. Zhao got 1.795 tons for the Tubingen mount, which is definitely overestimating it because the Tubingen mount was calculated to be 5.828 meters by him, while it's actually 4.14 meters in Bartlett et al. And then finally, Darius Now in a Twitter post also looked at the Tubingen mount and calculated that it had a volume of 1.2 meters cubed, which if we translate that to the mass with a specific gravity of around 1, going off of what Laramendi et al. Give for the specific gravities of marine vertebrates, then we get a mass of 1.2 tons. So it's really not that much of a range. It's usually around 1 to less than 2 tons, but again, these estimates aren't really reliable anymore. With that in mind, let's get a full time lapse of what that famous scene from Walking with Dinosaurs would have actually looked like. But you may be wondering, what about those fragmentary specimens that could be like Liopleurodon that hint at giant pliosaur size that I mentioned earlier? Well, that's gonna come in a future video. That's right, I decided to split this because this video is getting really long and the editing is gonna kill me. Therefore, after the Cruel Seas redesign video comes out, I will get to that. And then afterwards I'll make a video on the actual biggest pliosaurs and the paleoecological implications surrounding it. If you want to see those videos early, please consider becoming a member. Members will be able to get the videos early and get some members-only content, such as some of the stuff I cut from this video and drawings of creatures that you recommend, as well as voting on future videos. In any case, let me know what you thought of the video and comment what your opinion on Walking with Dinosaurs Liopleurodon was. And subscribe, like, I'll see you next time.